Hello everyone, this is Prayana Subba, Assistant Professor in the Department of History, Salesian College, Sonada, tuning into Radio Salesian EduPod's lecture series. Today is the second lecture and I am taking the fourth semester's honors paper CC10. We were discussing the fifth unit, patterns of regional politics, under which the topic of discussion was Mughal decline. So by now we had discussed 10 factors for the decline of the Mughals by various historians. And then let's move forward with another factor that can be the reason for the decline of the Mughal, and that is Jagirdari crisis. Now what is Jagirdari crisis is, see, in the 18th century India, the Mughals were going through a crisis. Now what kind of crisis this was economic crisis. In a very simple language, what was Jagirdari crisis is the number of the Jagirdars we have mentioned earlier, the number of the Jagirdars or the Mansabdars who were getting their salary in Jagir or land, they were increasing day by day, but then land was not something that could be stretched. It was stable. So the crisis was that the number of the Jagirdars were large, but whereas land was few. But how this problem was created was, see, 4/5 of the Mughal land revenue were under Mansabdars. 4/5 of, like, out of 5, 4 were under the Mansabdars, and then it was unevenly distributed. Like, if there were 8,000 Mansabdars, 444 controlled over 61%. Like, very few number control large number of lands. The other, those who were left, they had got no land at all. So that created jealousy, tension, rivalry and competition among the Mansabdar. As Satish Chandra says, the available social surplus was insufficient to defray the cost of administration, pay for wars of one type or another, and to give the ruling class a standard of life in keeping with their expectations. So now there was a kind of economic crisis where Jamindars and Jagirdars were not getting land. Now, if they're not getting land, they'll not get revenue. If they'll not get revenue, they'll not get money. So they were starting to live their life in crisis. Like, they had to wait. They are assigned Jagirdars, but then they had to wait for 3-4 years to get their land, and that was the crisis. Jama in the South India was high, but hustle was less. Like, estimated revenue was high, but then what actually they got was less. There was continuous price rise in the late 17th century in luxury goods from European market, which distressed the Mughal aristocracy. Like, the Mughal aristocracy was very much fond of luxurious items. They used to get all the luxurious items from the European market. Now, when there was price rise and on the other hand there was Jagirdari crisis, they could not afford these things. So then their condition was weakening. And then once they get land also, these Jagirdars, there was no guarantee whether they would be transferred within a few time or not. So there was no personal safety. There was a kind of personal insecurity that these Jagirdars were facing. So these Jagirdari crisis also led towards the Mughal decline, because these Jagirdars were the backbones of the Mughal administration. So if they would not function properly, then the administration, the whole of the revenue system will not function properly. Another factor that we can discuss for the downfall of the Mughal is the Deccan Wars as taken by Aurangzeb. See, historians also argue that Jagirdari crisis cannot be wholly responsible towards the decline of the Mughals, because Jagirdars always, like, they always revolted on something or the other matter. But then it was because of Aurangzeb's Deccan campaign, because when he won over Bijapur and Golconda, that not only led towards the expansion of the empire but also led towards the rise of the number of Mansabdars or Jagirdars. And there was political turmoil which made the revenue collection a difficult task. J.F. Richard believes that the crisis was artificial and due to Aurangzeb's wrong policy, because Aurangzeb could have utilized the new land which was conquered in the south to solve the Jagirdari crisis, but then land was instead converted into Khalisa land to meet the further expansions in the Deccan campaign. There was 23% rise in the revenue income, but Aurangzeb lost the opportunity. So what J.F. Richard is trying to say is that Aurangzeb could have solved this Jagirdari crisis because he had newly expanded the territory. There was new land, and he could have given this new land to the Jagirdars who were already waiting. But then this new land he converted into Khalisa land. Now, what is this Khalisa land? Is the revenue collected from this land would directly go to the state treasury. That will not go into the hand of the Jagirdars. So these this treasury, which was directly into the royal hand, would be utilized for further Deccan campaigns. So that was not utilized properly. That is what J.F. Richard is trying to say. But Satish Chandra again contradicts. He says that Deccan was always a deficit, like it was not a very fertile area to get more of the revenue. So that is very controversial. Like even if Aurangzeb could, he would have used those revenue, that could have hardly solved the problem, is what Satish Chandra is trying to say. Next, we have weak emperors to deal with the problem. So the problem was there already. So when Aurangzeb died, the problem was left to his successors. But then there was group politics going on. There were kingmakers, and that was the order of the day. Like there was conspiracy and all the things happening in the court, each wanting to influence just the emperor to get the benefit. After the death of Bahadur Shah, the problem reached to its crisis. There were some low-ranking officials for whom it was very hard to maintain their lifestyle. Now, revenue collection was becoming increasingly difficult day by day, and then problem intensified with Jahandar Shah, Farooq Shiar, Muhammad Shah. They tried to solve the problem by converting the Khalisa lands into Jagir land and distributing them, but then distribution was indiscriminate. That could not solve the problem. But then what it did instead was it impoverished the emperor. Like the treasury was going bankrupt day by day. Nizam-ul-Mulk, who was the wazir, he tried to solve the problem through redistribution of the land, but then he lost to court politics. He could not win over the court politics, so he gave up. So the incompetent rulers after Aurangzeb were also responsible towards the decline of the Mughals. Another can be division of nobility. We already saw that the aristocracy were diverse in nature, Irani Turani groups. Now, looking further to this point, so this nobility, which was already fragmented into various groups, Irani, which was led by Ashad Khan and his son Zulfikar Khan, Turani group, which was led by Ghaziuddin Khan, Firoz Jung and his son Chinkulij Khan. Then on the other hand, we had Hindustani group under Syed brother Khan-i-Durrani. Some Afghans and some Hindus were also there. Now these groups they were organized not around ethnicity or religion, but on family ties, personal friendship, and more on their selfish motives. This fraction never took violent form, nor even challenged divine right of the Timurids to rule. But see, like they were not in a open battle with themselves, but there were conspiracies within going on. They tried to have influences over the emperor. One, like the proximity or the closeness of one person would envy the other one, likewise. And they would not do their duties properly. They would not maintain the soldiers and the horses properly. They would not. There would not be proper supervision over these Jagirdars also, these nobles also. So that ultimately what happened, it resulted in the weakening of army and that of the Mughal Empire as a whole. Mughals were no longer invincible. That was visible. They were defeated they were sacked by various foreigners and the internal Marathas also. No fresh technology was there. No new input or organization and innovation was there in army. Nobles were busy carving out their own autonomous and semi-autonomous principalities for themselves. So what it led towards? It led towards the virtual fragmentation of the empire. So we see that because of the division in the nobility also, the Mughals were actually fragmenting into sections. Like the mighty Mughals were fragmenting into various regional states. That is the next topic for our discussion also. Now, why would these peasants revolt against the state? Was because the state was increasing its economic pressure upon the peasants, and then these peasants were also having some regional sentiments against the centralized power. Now see, peasant revolt was not a new thing. The peasant unrest was also a problem before, but army was strong enough to handle it. But in the late 17th and 18th century, there was weakness in the central power, and army was also in the decline, and the oppression increased. And then what happened was peasants' resistance also became widespread. Most commonly, they were led by local jamindars who had local ties with the peasants. They were fully backed by these oppressed peasants, and then they were too strong for the Mughal authority to handle. Now, why would this peasants' revolt? Is like we have already mentioned that because of the regional and communitarian identities against the intruding centralizing power. Now, they no longer wanted to be under the Mughals. Second one, because that was also against the Aurangzeb's religious policies. But this is hardly to be true, because towards the later years of his life, Aurangzeb had almost turned liberal to gain support from the Hindus against his enemies. The third factor might be property relation of the Mughal Empire. Mughal had the unquestionable right over the land. That was not something to be questioned. But then Irfan Habib says that Mughal land revenue system rested on compromise. What kind of compromise? Like, they would extract the surplus from the peasant, but then they would leave sufficient amount for the peasant subsistence, because if they were not left with the surplus, then they cannot continue the further production. But while larger peasants, they survived, what happened was the smaller peasants were the one who felt the pressure. In Zapt areas, or the areas which were measured, revenue demand was 1/3, but it varied from region to region. In some regions it was half, and in some other regions which were more fertile like Gujarat, it was 3/4. So 20% were collected from the Khalisa land, whereas the 80% of the land revenue went towards the Jagirdars. It was collected through Jagirdars. Now what happened because of this was, when the state was increasing its pressure on the revenue collection, the direct influence was those on the peasants, the lower peasants, and the primary jamindars, and they started revolting against the empire. So that also caused a problem towards the decline. Next was Jamindari crisis. Now, below the demand of the state and above that of the peasants were those of the local landlords or the jamindars. Now, these jamindars were of major three types. First one was autonomous rajas, who were incorporated into Mughal bureaucracy. In turn, they would give the fixed payment to the state, that was peshkars, and then they were given watan jagir for their loyalty. They were larger rajas, big rajas, who accepted the suzerainty of the Mughals. Second was the intermediary jamindars. They would collect the revenue from their own jamindari as well as from the other primary jamindars. Like, they were the middle one. They were considered to be the backbone of the revenue administration. Then the lower one were the primary jamindars, or also known as Malguzari jamindars. They had independent right over the land. It was through them that revenue was collected from peasants. For the collection of the revenue, they got nankar, or revenue free land from the state, as a reward for proper collection. They had local ties with the peasants based on class, clan, and religion. Their role was undeniably important. They were of higher as well as of lower rank. They were as low as larger peasants also sometimes. Like, they can go as low as the peasants, but of the larger peasants. So below this three-tier structure of jamindars were the peasants. Now, peasants were also of two types. One was khudkasht and another one was paikasht. Now, who were those khudkasht? Were the peasants with occupancy right over the land, and the paikasht were the landless, vagrant peasants who were the rented tillers of the land. Today we will stop till here. We have discussed the three-tier structure of the jamindars, and we also tried to look into the two types of peasants. In the next lecture, I'll try to explain how this structure or overall crisis in the jamindar system also created a problem in the Mughal system, and that led towards its decline. Thank you so much.